In a class, suddenly the atmosphere turned terrible and made them shiver in fear. Not only the teacher but all the students also felt the same atmosphere, except for this new student who even fell asleep. His name is Baki Hanma, a transfer student. In a break time, Baki is challenged by some school thugs who want to give him a lesson, but they don't know how. They suddenly get scared just by seeing Baki's eyes. They felt that Baki was not just anyone because his aura alone gave them goosebumps. They let him go, and Baki left casually. For him, it was better to avoid fighting than to engage in meaningless fights. Suddenly, a limousine stopped in front of the school. Their school had the arrival of a nobleman, namely the 11th generation Tokugawa. He is Mitsunari Tokugawa, who is highly respected and loves martial arts. He was a famous person among the dungeon fighters because he was the one who was in charge of it. Tokugawa came to the school because he wanted to meet Baki. This surprised the staff and principal of the school. Tokugawa entered the principal's office and he asked the principal to call Baki. When Baki enters the room, he greets him with joy and calls Baki the champion, but Baki feels uncomfortable with that title. After that, Tokugawa asked the principal and his staff to leave the room. After the school staff left, Tokugawa immediately took out a black box. Baki then asked what was in the box. Tokugawa explained that the box contained nitroglycerin, simply that it was the raw material for bombs. The nitroglycerin he was carrying was crystallizing, an abnormality where 100 years ago humans tried to freeze it but failed. Nitroglycerin could never be frozen until finally in the 20th century, glycerin all over the world suddenly crystallized. This is referred to as synchronization. But there is something else similar to that synchronization. Tokugawa informs Baki that in the next few days, overwhelming forces from all over the world will be coming towards Tokyo simultaneously. In an underwater prison in America, the police are moving a giant on death row and will execute him by hanging. Shortly before being executed, the priest asked what the last words he wanted to say. Dorian, the death row convict, answered emphatically that he wanted to taste defeat before dying. Immediately he was hanged. After 10 minutes of being hanged, the police called a doctor to check whether Dorian was really dead. But to his surprise, Dorian was still alive, and he immediately slaughtered all the police present. Dorian then writes a message in blood that says he is heading to Tokyo. Moving on to another place, an inmate named Doyle is preparing to be executed in an electric chair. Just like Dorian, his last words were that he wanted to taste defeat. But the executor didn't care and executed him. The shocking thing also happened. Doyle, who had been sitting lifeless, suddenly woke up and attacked everyone in the room. He also decided to go to Tokyo to taste defeat. In addition, in 3 other places the same thing happened, where death convicts named Spek, Sikorsky, and Ryuku Yanagi also managed to escape execution. They also wrote a message that they would go to Tokyo to experience what defeat is. Tokugawa warns Baki to be careful because of this strange incident, where there are 5 death row convicts who, without any relationship, simultaneously want to go to Tokyo and meet their defeat. That's the new synchronization that Tokugawa meant. That afternoon, Baki was attacked by a group of delinquents, but it was not a big problem for him. Baki then plays around with them and defeats them easily. However, one of them was carrying a gun and pointed it at Baki. Baki was silent. He was shocked and scared. But Baki wasn't afraid of the man with the gun. He was afraid of the giant man behind him. He was a Spek. He asked for the gun the thug was carrying and shot the gun in his cheek. Spek did this to show that guns would not work on him. Baki, who was silent, was shocked when Spek asked him to shake hands. When shaking hands, Spek used the hand of one of his victims. Baki, who noticed the human hand that had been released, was shocked to death. It was then that Spek began to brutally beat Baki. Someone called the police and arrested Spek. Baki, who was still able to stand straight, was suddenly asked to shake hands again by Spek. Spek says this is a real handshake. Without further ado, when Baki greeted him, he immediately hit Baki again. Meanwhile, in an apartment, a red-haired man is seen watching news about the escape of 5 convicts who were in Tokyo while stretching his muscles. He is Yujiro Hanma, father of Baki Hanma. He is one of the most feared people in Japan. Even the military is afraid of him. Moving to another place, Yanagi is meeting one of his old friends, more specifically his old enemy. He named Shibukawa, used to fight with Yanagi. Shibukawa was the founder of the jujutsu technique and relied on concentrated attacks on the enemy's physical vital points, allowing him to overpower tough opponents. Now Yanagi comes to challenge him to a fight, but Yanagi throws a pot of hot water at him. When the hot water vapor scattered, suddenly a small knife was pointed at Shibukawa's eyes, and Yanagi intended to stab him. Meanwhile, Spec is seen enjoying his stay in prison. He felt that prison was like his home, very comfortable with fresh air and delicious food, even though the portions were small. He was comfortable living in prison while preparing to defeat Baki. Feeling still hungry, Spec then went to break into the prison to find food. When the police commissioner named Sonoda was relieving himself in the bathroom, he was surprised to see that Spec was also urinating next to him. Spontaneously, the commissioner kicked Spec. Spec said he was out of a walk looking for food, then stuffed a bean bun into the commissioner's mouth. The prison alarm then sounded when the guards noticed that Spec's prison room was broken. Those who were panicking were suddenly surprised by Spec, who suddenly appeared behind them and said that he wasn't going anywhere. Moving on to another place, in a dojo there is a sparring between two of its members. Shortly after their sparring, they were surprised by the arrival of a convict named Dorian, who had come looking for someone named Doppo Orochi. Dorian immediately beat the two strongest members in the dojo with ease. He threw pieces of wood at their throats, then burned them with alcohol. That afternoon at his school, Baki was doing a physical test that was done by his teacher. This is the first time for Baki to do a physical test. Baki was so conspicuous among his friends, he made a hole in the ground with his stance before running the 100 EM. He played baseball and hit the ball soared high into the sky. He did a pull-up, but broke it instead. According to his teacher, Baki has extraordinary physical strength, but due to the constant damage to the facility, Baki is in danger of failing the sports test. The final test determines whether Baki will pass or not, which is the 1,500-meter sprint test. His teacher was surprised that Baki recorded a record of 3 minutes and 26 seconds, where he almost beat the world's record in the 800 meters, but Baki did it in the 1,500 meters. Because Baki ran without using technique and only relied on physical strength, he experienced muscle cramps and made him finish last. Even though Baki failed the final test, his teacher still passed him because he realized that Baki had much stronger physical strength than the average human. On the other hand, Mr. Tokugawa is having a meal with another dungeon fighter named Igari, who fought Baki last year. Suddenly they were attacked by Sikorsky and made him lie down. This made Igari very angry and tried to counterattack Sikorsky, but he met the same fate as his friend, where he was dying with grievous wounds in his face. Mr. Tokugawa then took Sikorsky to his underground battle area. On the other hand, Spec disappeared from the search and wrote a letter that he would be back soon. Meanwhile, Mr. Tokugawa and Sikorsky arrived at the arena. Another 4 monster prisoners appeared. Mr. Tokugawa asked them what made them all come and gather in Tokyo. They answered in unison that they wanted to taste defeat, and Mr. Tokugawa was ready to serve him. Mr. Tokugawa was then surprised by the appearance of Baki, along with 4 other dungeon fighters. They are all divided into 2 teams, where one team contains 5 convicts and 5 dungeon fighters. Fighters from various martial arts circles came to find the strongest fighter, and the one who came out victorious was Baki, this 17-year-old boy. But this tournament is a little different, not in the ring, but fighting in everyday life as usual. It doesn't matter in any situation in the middle of the road, cooking, jamming, or drinking coffee. They are asked to prepare against attacks from the enemy, and there are no binding rules, and the fight starts from now. Knowing the system like that, Baki was about to go home first after Tokugawa dismissed them. Moments later, Police Commissioner Sonoda was confused and surprised to find Spec back in his cell, as if it was his residence. Meanwhile, Dorian, who was walking, was blocked by Doppo Orochi, who is now his rival. He confronted and targeted Dorian as his first opponent to get revenge for yesterday's commotion. but Doppo attacked him before Dorian. Dorian took out his lighter while holding the alcohol he always carried with him. Then Dorian sprayed it at Doppo's smoke, causing a huge flame. But unfortunately, Doppo has basic techniques in fending off fire. On the other hand, Kurosaki was intercepted by Igari, whom he had battered before, and came to him with 2 of his men. Back to Doppo, who was hit by Dorian's attack from the barely visible thin strings, managed to cut his hand off. The fact is that it's not a 5000s lighter, but a weapon tucked into a thin wire made of titanium material with very sharp cuts. The material that is often used in astronaut cables, bulletproof vests, and even able to withstand family loads of up to 200 kilograms. Because of that, Dorian allowed himself to be constantly attacked so that he would unknowingly attach the thread to Doppo's wrist. But even though his hand was cut off, previously his fingers were broken because he was trying to practice through rattan. Obviously, this is not a problem for Doppo. When Dorian was knocked off his feet, Doppo used his time to temporarily escape and made Dorian more passionate about this game. Back to Sikorsky, who was being held captive in the boxing ring, and Igari shot him repeatedly without hesitation. But Sikorsky was still alive, and in fact he had prepared a bulletproof vest on his body and turned to slaughter them all. Moving on to Baki, who is with his female schoolmate named Kazui Matsumoto, and he is also the owner of the house that Baki lives in now. For the first time, Kazue went on a date with Baki, which made them a bit nervous. They walked around until late at night. But when Baki expressed his comfort to Kazue, suddenly Spec appeared in front of Baki. Baki had already come to his senses with his sharp gaze. Suddenly, a Yakuza boss named Hanayama appears to take over the fight and challenges Spec, and even Spec is willing to start the fight right away. There was blood coming out of his nose, which made Hanayama even more serious about dealing with it and started taking off his clothes. His back is covered with Yakuza tattoos, and it is known that Hanayama cannot be underestimated because as a Yakuza leader, it is normal for him to face danger and not hesitate to go to rival Yakuza groups and then slaughter them all alone. And Spec, who also has a tattoo, is not afraid to face it. Feeling unsatisfied, he took a garden chair and immediately slammed it on Hanayama. But that meant nothing to Hanayama. Then Spec started to clench his fist in the same position as Hanayama because it was known that Spec's goal was not an ordinary fist. That can be proven to an incident the previous year where a police officer discovered the marks of a tremendous blow on the Statue of Liberty. The crack that engulfed the statue collapsed and required many powerful steel ropes to prevent the statue from collapsing. With good breath timing, Spec is able to hold his breath underwater for quite a long time. Just like when he escaped from the submarine prison, Spec can attack his opponent for up to 5 minutes with non-stop punches. Regardless of how overwhelmed his opponent is, Spec will continue to attack, but the fact is that one punch can make Spec bounce. Moving on to the police station, Pak Sonoda scolded his members because Spec had run away again and was shown the CCTV footage. How could Spec escape and easily fend off the elite anti-terrorist squad? Back to Hanayama, who countered Spec's attack. After being repeatedly hit by Hanayama, with a bit of drama, Spec asked to stop. However, while he was off guard, Spec put a flammable bullet that he had stolen from the police into Hanayama's mouth. Even though Hanayama's mouth was shattered, his body still stood strong and immediately counterattacked and smashed it into the power line. Long story short, the police station was shocked when Hanayama stared at Spec, who was already in front of him, and it was clear that the police, who saw Spec in such a state, made them gape. Paying respects to Hanayama's help in catching Spec, Mr. Sonoda thanks Hanayama for his help and is about to drive him home. But suddenly, Spec woke up and lifted the car and overturned the car in which Hanayama was driving. The fact that the police guarding him had been slaughtered by him. Hanayama, who got out of the car, then continued to be hit with iron by Spec. With a gun, Spec also fired several shots and made it difficult for Hanayama to counterattack. Do not hesitate by trampling on his face. Spec started to point the gun to his mouth, and Hanayama spontaneously got up and pointed the point of the gun at his hollow cheek, and pulled Speck's leg and hit him back mercilessly. But Speck, who was so cunning in using a flashbang that could emit light that he had stolen from the police, made Hanayama have to freeze because he couldn't see the enemy. Speck immediately counterattacked Hanayama's body with his body. But Speck didn't know who he was fighting was the most feared Yakuza. He easily tore Speck's hand. But he didn't stay silent. With such intense pain, Speck immediately stabbed his ear with his middle finger. And finally, the battle was won by the legendary Yakuza Hanayama. Moving a few days later at the hospital, Speck was still alive and looked like he was in his 50s. Now he was lying thin and helpless and looked much older according to his real age, which was 97 years old. Then the doctor assumed that if the human dream that he had wished for came true. Everything seemed like the end of everything and had no reason to support his life again, and it was certain that Speck was as satisfied with his defeat as he had hoped. Transferring to school, Baki seems bored with his exams. The headmaster came to rebuke Baki and advised him that all matters cannot be solved by muscles, but by brains. No matter how strong Baki is, he still can't lift a car alone. No matter how fast he swims, he will still lose to a speeding boat, and no matter how fast he runs, it's impossible to beat a motorbike. Then he left Baki alone. On the side of the school, one of the 5 monsters was about to meet him. Yes, it is Doyle coming against the tray. Not caring about class time, Doyle quickly hit the teacher who interfered, and Baki was moved to tears because he had just been scolded by the teacher and thanked him for attacking his teacher. Baki himself had no intention of fighting Doyle and was simply avoiding him. Feeling that he was already far away, Baki greeted the gardener he met until an attack attacked him. Who would have thought? The 2 people were Yanagi, one of the dead convicts, and used a wushu weapon with a kind of sickle at the end and immediately attacked. Luckily, Baki was able to avoid Yanagi's attack and was only hit by his clothes. But suddenly Shibukawa appears and quickly throws a teapot filled with water, just like what Yanagi did at that time. But fortunately, the water was cold and quickly attacked. The fact is that Yanagi uses iron claws behind his palms, and because the fight is without rules, Shibukawa and Baki will fight Yanagi alone together. Despite receiving attacks from them, Yanagi still survives, and Shibukawa warns Baki to be careful with him because he is known as Yanagi the Poison. Yanagi slowly approached Baki and asked what the most dangerous gases in the world were. Although sarin and carbon monoxide are considered the most toxic, oxygen gas can already kill, he said. On the other hand, we are shown a giant human who is known to be a sumo athlete who is being treated in a hospital. He is one of Yanagi's victims by using the same move that was done on Baki, which makes him now haunted by fear. Returning to Baki, who fainted with his eyes open, Shibukawa was confused by Yanagi's way of fighting, and Yanagi explained that humans are always surrounded by 21% oxygen to live. Likewise, if humans are in a vacuum or a very narrow place, the oxygen level will decrease and the body will automatically weaken. Nausea, colds, and coughing will occur. Organs will weaken and will spontaneously pass out. In fact, when Yanagi was about to bring his hand to Baki's nose, Yanagi managed to reduce the oxygen by 6% and clearly created a vacuum that made Baki faint. But the fact is that this does not apply to humans, but also to inanimate objects. Sensing that the police are coming, Yanagi quickly runs away, and while stomping on Baki, wakes him up, and Shibukawa reveals that Baki has lost the fight this time. Long story short, 5 underground arena fighters were gathering with Mr. Tokugawa, but when Baki was about to go home, he was surprised by Dorian, who had attacked them and had destroyed all the guards armed with gasoline. He wanted to burn them all. But suddenly Katsumi was behind him. In fact, it was Dorian who had to be burned with his own gasoline by Katsumi Orochi Doppo's son. Doppo is quite proud of his son because just now Katsumi has implemented the beauty of karate, namely avoiding carrying weapons like the basis of karate. Because the human body is equipped with hands that can become weapons, and indeed, if necessary, anything that sticks all over our body like a bag can be used as a weapon. But preparing weapons before fighting only lowers the self-esteem of karate fighters. The fact is that Dorian was still able to get up and chuckled, challenging Doppo to fight. But Katsumi offered him to fight also with his teacher Kyusumi Katu, who is also a member of Dojo Shinkai who prefers to fight on the field. Dorian's ear was cut off by the transparent nylon gun that Katu had prepared. But preparing weapons in battle is a deviant thing for the karate school and has disappointed Orochi Doppo. Then he showed his unarmed fighting style. But that opportunity was used by Dorian to wrap around them with his piano string weapon, but was lucky to be cut off by Doppo with his bare hands. Documents in karate explain they turned hands and feet into weapons with countless hours of practice until they turned them into swords. And no need for nylon as a weapon while mentioning Katu. Spontaneously, Dorian took out a grenade bomb from his mouth, and on the other hand, Dorian, who was full of burns, ran away from them with his bomb and entered an alley in the middle of the city, then plunged into an underground aqueduct to hide. The fact is that Dorian has a secret place underground. He quickly treats his ear wound, which was severed. However, he had to be surprised again by Katu, who managed to follow him and still has the ambition to beat him. Yes, this time Katu had to take Dorian's attack, and Dorian started to put his hand into the oil can and put the glass of the bottle on his hand. It was a style of American fighting in the hundreds of years in tournaments that are now outlawed. But Kanto doesn't want to follow that way of fighting. He has his own way. Had been bounced off by Dorian's attack, but Katu felt the sensation he wanted, and the fight was getting more fun for him. Katu's face was almost destroyed by the bottle attack aimed at his face, and Dorian attacked with his nose hair attack and continued to fatality while singing. Katu, who was still able to survive in such conditions, continued with a bottle attack to his face by receiving many attacks from Katu. Dorian made a loud clap that obviously didn't mean anything to Katu. Kato Uterus followed him with several punches and kicks, followed by stealing his eyes and feeling that victory would be on his side. Until the second clap from Dorian was heard, Katu was surprised by Dorian's eyes, which turned out to be fine without being hurt, and the fact that Dorian had just used a hypnotic illusion technique on Katu. By reading Katu's ambition and wanting to win this fight, it would be easy for Katu to fall into hypnosis, where Dorian casts shadows of his weaker self, and Katu attacks at will. But again, it's just a delusion Katu created himself. Dorian ended the attack with his transparent strings, making Katu helpless while apologizing to his teacher Orochi Doppo because he was too selfish in acting. Long story short, Retsu, who was training at Shinshikai, felt something unusual in his punching bag and found Katu dying in it and quickly took him to the hospital. After that incident, the situation at the dojo began to heat up, and Katsumi ordered all of its members to spread Dorian's photos all over the country and with 10,000 members. Meanwhile, Dorian, who was disguised in a restaurant, was approached by a waiter who apparently already knew him and found out that Katu was injured due to Dorian's actions and revealed that Dorian was being hunted by Shinshikai members who were spread all over the country and asked him to get ready until a group of Shinshikai students was waiting for him outside. Even the taxi he was riding in was also a member of the Shinshikai, so without realizing that their car had been followed by cars from different circles and professions who were also members of the Shinkai, who also wanted to beat up Dorian. Until finally, Dorian was dropped off at an amusement park and asked him to go inside to meet someone inside. But before entering, Dorian gave each driver a lesson who underestimated him. Arriving inside, Dorian was greeted by a clown and invited him to enjoy the rides inside. But in the middle of his fun, he was suddenly attacked by the third student of 7 Shinshikai named Atsushi Suedu, who wanted to avenge the defeat of his comrade Katu and didn't care if he had to die now. Dorian ran herding Saito up the roller coaster, which started to move until it reached the top. An excited Suedu looked at Dorian, who suddenly disappeared as the train started to dive. Dorian had already appeared behind him while locking his neck. However, they have to face difficulties with the roller coaster track, which starts to be extreme and makes it difficult for them to balance. Suedu, who remembers a little lesson from his teacher Orochi Doppo with the knowledge of Sanshi, namely, A technique found in battles on boats where the situation on the water is chaotic, the Sachi technique is created by positioning the feet slightly opposite in both directions to tolerate the force. Suedu, who was starting to understand, tried it while attacking Dorian, but Dorian preferred to jump both from above, making them crash together on the ground. Surprisingly, Dorian was still able to get up, and in fact Dorian used his strings, which can withstand 200 kilograms weight, to support his body by hooking it to a lamppost. But suddenly Katsumi, Retsu, and Doppo appear. Katsumi is disgusted by Dorian's way of fighting, but Dorian, who saw Retsu, actually knew Retsu deeper. The scene moves to the past when Retsu is still studying with his great teacher. At that time, Retsu was angry because he was not allowed to take the test to get the wooden title of Kung Fu Master. The teacher invited him to see their thick castle room, which had been broken down by one of the foreign talented students from the West 40 years ago, who broke through the rocks in just one night. Even though he was a foreigner, he had earned the title of Kung Fu Master. What the teacher was referring to was this Dorian, who held the title of Kung Fu Master, and immediately saluted him. After 10 years of Dorian's departure from the Kung Fu school, Retsu just got the title of Kung Fu Master and knows they are in the same college. In accordance with their Kung Fu teachings that they are prohibited from fighting each other within the same school, but free fights will still be carried out. Orochi Doppo will come forward to fight him and will avenge his hand that was cut off. Orochi Doppo took off his shirt and revealed a red undershirt, which implies that the mythical Orochi Doppo once wore it to defeat the largest Serbian tiger with his bare hands. It's true that Orochido's hand, which was previously severed, is now whole again, and reveals that at the time of the incident, Orochi immediately went to his customer's closed clinic. He was awaited by a talented doctor. With limited materials, Doppo had to be operated on without anesthesia, starting with joining the bones, followed by suturing the veins, blood vessels leading to the heart, nerves, and muscles. The operation was successful. Doppo can feel the movement in his fingers again, and now there will be a fight between two karateka masters. Dorian was crushed by Orochi Doppo's attack and suddenly whimpered as if helpless, but Doppo would end this fight. In fact, Dorian used the same hypnotic technique he had used to beat Katu back then. Now Doppo is only fighting with his wishful thinking that Dorian has succeeded in building. It was clear that Retsu, who witnessed this, was not the science taught at their academy, and now it was easy for Dorian to attack him. But he was surprised by Doppo, who suddenly parried his attack. In fact, Doppo, who was under the control of his own illusion, was still able to fight Dorian until he was completely defeated. It cannot be denied that the karateka legend is used to being in any situation that makes him sensitive to all attacks and even under hypnotic control. With brutal punches that smashed his ribs to pieces, followed by shattering joints and while rotating. Don't underestimate a man who has devoted his entire life to the martial art of karateka and now only has the last straw to end Dorian's life. But suddenly Katu appears in a wheelchair and full of bandages, asking for his turn to end Dorian's life. Followed by the doctor who treated Katu, who protested to Doppo to stop his patient's fight. In the end, Dorian whined. It was Dorian who actually admitted defeat, and Doppo told the doctor, "You wouldn't understand our world of martial arts practitioners with a human view of protein and calcium." Long story short, Katu and Dorian were treated at the same hospital, and the doctor x-rayed Dorian's hand and found a chip like a bomb trigger in his palm. At night, Dorian, who woke up, approached Katu, who was again unconscious. But he didn't attack. Dorian only regretted that Katu didn't finish him back then, and he still has the ambition to become the strongest. Moving on to Orochi Doppo, who is back at home and can't wait to see his wife after a few days of not coming home. But when he got inside, he was shocked by the messy house and didn't find his wife inside. He saw Dorian's lighter, which implied that this was Dorian's doing. Dorian detonated a bomb of his last weapon in his hand right in Doppo's face, which was now almost shapeless. Moving on to the part of Kazue, who just came back from a date with Baki. Baki stood in the middle of the road for 10 minutes while watching Kazue, who was running back to his house. However, during his escape, Kazue was a little disappointed because Baki invited him to his room, and Baki was also too embarrassed to reveal that he also originally wanted to invite Kazue to his room. Meanwhile, Dorian met Retsu in the middle of the road and was forced to punch Dorian, who had gone too far. Long story short, Dorian was brought in by an ambulance escorted by the police. It was Dorian who was starting to wake up, but this time his mentality was really broken and his psyche was disturbed, making him act like a child. Because it is undeniable that Dorian always loses in every battle and can only survive in a very embarrassing way. But even so, as a college friend, Retsu will continue to care for him. Back at the part where Kazue separated from the tray, Kazue quickly entered his house. Baki is not yet aware that another inmate is targeting him. On the other hand, Kazue was surprised again with Sikorsky behind him, and while threatening his mother would die if he didn't follow his orders. However, Baki suddenly arrives and gets angry because Sikorsky gone too far, involving the people closest to him in this fight. Baki, without hesitation, attacked him again and chased him out, and Baki came following to find Sikorsky not downstairs and leaving only his robes. Sure enough, the room was now a mess, and Kazue's mother, who was lying down, said that the person had brought Kazue. Meanwhile, at the Japanese Defense Office, a large meeting is being held, attended by several representatives of countries who are taking responsibility for their prisoners who roam Tokyo. Now that there are 3 more prisoners left, it is quite difficult to catch these monsters even with special forces. So it was decided to ask for the help of an Arizona prison inmate in America who is known to be very strong. Even though he is a convict, there are no penalties or sanctions against him, and he is free to go in and out of prison as he pleases because of his services, which have helped the police a lot, and his name is Oliver. Sonoda flies to America to the prison in the zone and asks for Oliver's help. But when he got inside, the head of the Arizona prison asked him to meet Oliver alone. Arriving inside, Pak Sonoda was shocked by his prison, which was decorated with tall, classy statues and expensive items. He is introduced to one of the freest convicts in the world, big and muscular. He is Oliver, who warmly welcomes Mr. Sonoda. Obviously, a prisoner with a lifestyle like the Sultan's made Mr. Sonoda exploded in confusion. Then Oliver tells how he has this freedom due to the fact that he is an expert hunter who can catch any criminal. All the prisoners here, he's the one who got them. That's why he got the facilities he wanted. Oliver gets news to catch a criminal who is holding a victim hostage while inviting Mr. Sonoda to come with him on duty to the location by helicopter. Arriving at a building that was almost destroyed, Oliver asked the police to just go home to rest and immediately entered the building alone. Arriving inside, Oliver met a middle-aged man armed with a firearm. In fact, he deliberately caused this commotion to lure Oliver out because he wanted revenge 24 years ago when he was nearly killed by Oliver's attack. While taking off his shirt, it was Oliver who seemed to challenge the man's revenge shot. Oliver's skin was too tough for his gun to penetrate. After finishing their task, they quickly went home and, in short, they headed straight to Tokyo to catch the remaining convicts with Mr. Sonoda, who couldn't stop thinking about Oliver's almost monster-like abilities. In the car heading to the office, Oliver told Pak Sonoda that he wanted to be alone and get out of the car as soon as possible. Meanwhile, Baki and Katsumi receive news from their father about Kazue's whereabouts. On the other hand, Kazue is held captive, and Yujiro's father, Baki, turns out to have already arrived there. Sikorsky matter-of-factly challenged the strongest man on Earth to fight him. Suddenly, Oliva appeared clutching Sikorsky's arm, causing him great pain. While greeting Yujiro, it turns out that they already know each other. Baki, who had arrived to see his lover like that, made Baki very angry, and it was difficult for him to forgive Sikorsky's behavior. Sikorsky had to jump from above, but Baki, who was offended by Oliva's words, nudged his actions and thought that Oliva was also an enemy. With several fatalities up and down, Baki was surprised that Oliva was fine. Suddenly, he had to be surprised again with Sikorsky, who was behind him asking for the second round, and it was known that Sikorsky was able to return to this floor after falling. It is common for him to re-hijack buildings. as well as how he was able to escape from the Russian prison. But even so, Baki was also still willing to throw him down as much as he wanted. Simultaneously, the police arrived. Sikorsky fled. Long story short. In the afternoon, in an abandoned building that became a hideout, Sikorsky was cleaning his body, but suddenly Baki came and asked him to fight for the third round. Even with Sikorsky completely naked, Baki didn't care. They had to finish this fight. Sikorsky had to be crushed by a series of attacks from Baki until Oliva appeared again, who appreciated Baki for the incident just now. His next task is to catch all the convicts. However, Baki refuses to give him up, considering himself to be belittled, and unfortunately, it's easy for Oliva to hold off Baki's attacks. Sikorsky, who had risen again, moved to challenge Oliva, knowing that he was being hunted by him. Sikorsky jumped off the building again, and Oliva made sure Sikorsky couldn't climb back up. Long story short, Oliver handed over Sikorsky, who was helpless, to Mr. Sonoda, and also thanked Baki for finding Sikorsky. The scene moves to the police station where Oliver is given a special room for him to find data about the 2 remaining inmates. Now, the search will focus on Doyle. Suddenly, a transvestite policeman arrives who delivers a cup of drink, but in fact it is Doyle in disguise. You can see that Oliver's face was injured by an iron elbow. Slashing is so commonplace for Oliver, he then immediately locks his room because he thinks this is good luck for him without having to bother looking for his prey. But who would have thought that the iron stuck in the dueling elbow was poison iron, which made him fall down because suddenly all his muscles stiffened. And in fact, the antidote is right there on the other side of the elbow. Then Doyle was still trying to get up, panting. Oliver quickly pulled his collar, but again by putting a razor in his shirt, made Oliver hurt. Doyle used this opportunity to run away until Mr. Sonoda and Mr. Shibukawa were about to approach Oliver's room. They had to be shocked by Oliver, who was injured, and the room was covered in blood. Oliver explained that there was a female police officer who had just suddenly attacked him, but had escaped through a ventilation shaft, which clearly made Mr. Sonoda confused. Then Oliver was quite happy that he met the jujutsu legend, whose techniques are now taught in every police force. Obviously curious for Oliver just how strong this Master Shibukawa was. Shibukawa happily accepted the challenge and started with a handshake. Oliver, who initially started fishing, suddenly had to bend over in pain because the grip must have been so strong and made him fall down. Switching to Shinshikai, I introduced Shinogi Kosho. He is not a basketball player but a karate fighter because he is underground, and his flagship move is a nerve breaker. It is also known that he is one of the Shinshikai trainers, and talking with Katsumi that he heard about rumors of convicts who want to seek defeat and have also caused a lot of chaos. Even though Kosho had lost in the underground arena tournament before, but he felt himself much stronger now and would take part in defeating the remaining convicts. Since this was a free fight and the Shinshikai students were scattered all over Japan, it was Katsumi who informed Doyle's position that he was in a hotel in one of his rooms. Meanwhile, Doyle himself was checking all his weapons and the machines that were embedded in his body, not only in the elbows, but in almost all metal-embedded joints, weapons, and his little finger, which was embedded with control buttons when needed. An old foreign man with the rank of Captain of the American Navy named Jerry and his old friend Yujiro Hanma appear. But while talking to Doyle, suddenly a bell rang and Gary had to fall down, which in fact was Kosho, who had come to give Doyle defeat. Had a seizure with a blank punch that clearly damaged the system installed in his body, but quickly calmed down and activated his weapon to attack back. I don't know what the attack was, but it clearly made Kosho's lower jaw shift, and with his bare hands, Kosho tried to position his shifting jaw. Meanwhile, Doyle activated all the weapons embedded in his body. It staggered toward Kosho, and Kosho started its attack first. But in fact, the unexpected explosive attack was in Doyle's body and made an ugly face that must be seriously injured. It appears that Doyle's body has been modified to withstand his own explosion. Jerry, who saw Doyle's way of fighting, was disappointed to see how he didn't fight like a man, only relying on the weapons embedded in his body. But for Doyle, as long as he can be the strongest, it doesn't matter to him. Moving on to Baki, who was lying in his room, suddenly Kazue came to visit him and revealed that he really always thinks about Baki at all times, and Baki also admits that he also always thinks about Kazue. Kazue was quite satisfied and relieved to hear Baki's statement and said goodbye to go home. Moving on to the Chinese restaurant, Retsu was surprised by a big man who finished a pig in an instant. When it was finished, the man knew Retsu and had seen him in an underground battle. Introducing him named Jack Hanma, it is known that Jack is one of Yujiro Hanma's sons from Canada and also Baki's half-brother. By consuming doping and drugs and coupled with extreme training, Jack got his best body. It is known that he once faced his half-sister Baki in the underground arena tournament, but even so, Jack considered Baki like his own brother until finally the fight was won by Baki. But this time, Jack's body was much taller and bigger, making Retsu confused. Meanwhile, Kosho is being treated in the hospital due to Doyle's explosion attack and is treated by a doctor named Shinogi, who is also an underground arena fighter, who is also feared in tournaments because of his ability to combine self-defense with medicine, which is his trademark, and it is also known that Shinogi is the older brother of Kosho. In a restaurant, Jack is seen eating bones voraciously to nourish his bones to continue growing, and Jack was also a Shinogi patient when his body was full of broken bones after fighting Baki in the underground arena. At that time, Jack also asked Shinogi to lengthen his bones, even though many could not stand it due to the pain during bone-lengthening surgery. But unlike Jack, who was able to endure the pain until he managed to get the body he wanted. Now it is Jack who has received news that Shinogi's younger brother was injured by an inmate named Doyle. Jack is ready to avenge his sister. On the other hand, Retsu, who was shopping at the mall, accidentally met Doyle, who was also about to enter the elevator. Inevitably, in this situation, they went together to find a roomy place to fight. But before that, Dell asked Retsu to go drink some beer first. Retsu asks if Doyle used explosives to attack Kosho, and Doyle admits he did. Before Retsu attacked him, but in fact, Doyle's attack was thwarted by Retsu, who attacked him first with a kunai that almost hit him in the eye. Retsu immediately attacked Doyle with fire, but out of pity, Retsu was still kind enough to put out the fire on his body. But lying while showing some kunai under his clothes. Retsu attacks Doyle with his kunai. Doyle's body is already filled with kunai embedded in his body. Doyle fell due to another attack that made his kunai sink deeper. Doyle was cornered. He also sprayed blood that hit his eyes and made Retsu even more angry because he considered and underestimated the Chinese self and started using rope weapons, then tied Doyle and was going to end it with a sword. But Doyle, who was still able to stand, tried to run away from Retsu until he felt pressured and used a smoke bomb to disappear. Retsu assumed that Doyle escaped from the sinkhole, but in fact it was just a diversion from Doyle, who had stabbed him in the back, but the attack turned out to be meaningless for Retsu. Retsu immediately attacked Doyle with a 1,000-handed attack and was dissatisfied. Retsu took out an improvised spear from his pants and attacked Doyle a little and asked him if he had admitted defeat. But he could still stand and never admit defeat, and regretted that Retsu didn't finish him right away, even though he was only one step away from defeat. Defeats him until Doyle counterattacks. What was unexpected was that Jack suddenly appeared, injecting anesthetic into Retsu, who suddenly fainted, then woke him up and returned his groceries. Jack reveals to Doyle that it is not Retsu, but it is him out for revenge. They are not fighting now and waiting for Doyle to get better, then he will fight him. Embarrassed by the underground arena fighters who easily overpower him, but Doyle lets Retsu on the sidelines without attacking him. Doyle limped away, but he saw a fainted Retsu being approached by some delinquents who took the opportunity to snatch his wallet. Even though they were both rivals, Doyle considered that this situation was a different story by asking them to return his wallet, but those who refused made Doyle have to act. However, when he was about to leave, a stray dog harassed Retsu, who was helpless, and because of this situation, they had different concepts in their fight. If something happened to Retsu with his current state, who hurt Retsu, Doyle would stand in front of him to guard him until he regained consciousness. Long story short morning greeting, Retsu, who started to wake up, saw Doyle, who was standing stiffly with a cheerful face, implying that Doyle had taken care of himself while he was unconscious. Even though the two of them were enemies, it made Retsu uncomfortable and wondered who had drugged him. But now he has to save himself, whose condition is critical, on the verge of death, while taking off his clothes to carry him to quickly take him to get treatment. Long story short, Doyle's Shinshikai martial arts school began to awaken. Doyle was treated at the health facility there, and it was seen that Retsu came in to greet him while delivering food and revealed that he had just fainted for 2 days and 2 nights in this place. The Shinshikai students also donated their blood for Doyle, who also lost a lot of blood. Doyle, who was a little awake at that time, was quite amazed by Retsu's ability to walk on water. Even so, Retsu allowed Doyle to rest, and Doyle thanked him for his help. Long story short, Retsu, who came back to visit, had seen Doyle, who was no longer in his room, and it was clear that this didn't surprise Retsu, and it was impossible for Doyle to stay in the enemy's cage all the time. Moving on. In the evening, in the middle of training, the karate appeared there, and while approaching them and expressed their thanks very much for donating blood for him. Katsumi objected to this, but even so, the battle still had to be resolved by requiring them to fight, said Doyle, and Katsumi also had no objection and was willing to fight him directly. In front of the Shinshikai students, and because this was a free fight, Doyle had to use the weapon he had prepared in his bag. Doyle took out an aluminum jacket that is often used by firefighters and quickly shook off the flour he had prepared in the dojo, making it hard for them to see and made them cough in such a situation. It was vaguely visible that Doyle wanted to burn them together. It could happen, in fact, when flammable particles filled the room. It would be easy for fire to spread, which grabbed each other particles in the vicinity and could even trigger an explosion. Doppo offends Doyle, who doesn't want to admit defeat, even though it's already 2 people, Oliver and Retsu, who easily overwhelmed Doyle to the point of abysmally. Then Doppo led Doyle to challenge him to a duel in the field. Then, after wanting to use all of his weapons or not to fight this old man, he said, "But what is clear as a karateka seems taboo for him to use weapons to fight." Obviously, those words made Doyle angry and started to attack with brutal blows, instantly knocking him unconscious, and suddenly he had woken up inside the Shinshikai HQ. Doyle was awaited by Katsumi in front of him. There were second-degree burns all over his body from Doyle's behavior at the time, and asked if you had admitted defeat. Katsumi will continue to do that until Doyle really admits defeat. Until the afternoon Katsumi returned to greet, Doyle regained consciousness with Katsumi, who was still waiting for him, and again asked the same question, but Doyle, who was stubborn, chuckled, attacking. Long story short, Katsumi still has to get treatment for his burns and apologizes to the doctor for having witnessed the incident of assaulting Doyle in the same room. But doctors can't do anything about it, knowing that it happens often in the world of martial arts, and it's only doing their job to heal patients. Meanwhile, fighters only destroy their opponent's body. Until it was felt that Doyle had regained consciousness, Katsumi returned to him and invited Dell to have breakfast first with Katsumi, who was eating rice balls. After finishing, Doyle was eager to return to challenge, but again, Doyle was easily defeated, and for the last time asked Doyle if he had admitted defeat. Long story short, the night came. Doyle, who had been treated, woke up and was spontaneously alert for an attack from Katsumi. But the assistant who was waiting for him came and gave a message from Katsumi that the winner in this fight was him or Doyle himself. He was the one who brought up the doctor's words that a fighter was in charge of destroying the enemy's body, but the fact was that Katsumi was not talented in this matter and couldn't teach him more than that. It would be better for him to admit defeat, he said. Hearing the message made Doyle stunned, and long story short, for the first time Doyle knelt seriously to admit defeat. On the other hand, Tokugawa visited a martial arts hermitage called the Path of the Void. It can be seen that all the students are foreigners from various countries because the coach named Master Kunimatsu is better known abroad than in Japan. Introduce him named Master Kunimatsu, who has one hand, and while welcoming him to drink tea, Tokugawa, who has been shocked by Master Kunimatsu's fingers, which are so terrible like they are not human fingers. Then Tokugawa asked what was meant by the void martial art, and this Kunimatsu still explained that this art was the art of vacuum killing. While giving the example of himself lifting a heavy bowling ball with one hand very easily, Kunimatsu still explained that two things could happen because he created a void that became a vacuum in his palm. But when Tokugawa tried, it was clear it failed, and Kunimatsu explained that he had a student with above-average abilities who could create a vacuum even on a piece of paper. Even if the palm was in front of the nose, then that person would be in danger. That person named Yanagi was skilled in the vacuum that Tokugawa had guessed. The fact is that Kunimatsu's left arm was also cut off because of Yanagi's actions. Where is Yanagi to make a very deadly hand that he himself concocts with poisonous beetles plus herbs, then pounded as needed? After grinding it well, he immediately mixes it with sand to make poisonous sand and then uses it for himself to train his right hand. Practice day and night to create a very lethal hand. Then, after practicing, you must immediately neutralize the poison by using an antidote. This is done continuously to create self-immunity from the poison, and this is one of the dangerous exercises. In this path of emptiness, and not a few students who cut off their hands because they could not bear the extreme pain while practicing this. But unlike Yanagi himself, the first human who was able to perfect the deadly hand, and even if it hits human skin, the victim's flesh will rot and even destroy the bones in it, which will end in death. Moving on to a prison that Sikorsky lives in, a prison with such tight security that even the prison tower has no exit action, but the only way is to get out using only a helicopter. However, Sonoda assumed that Sikorsky could climb outside the building with his bare hands. On the other hand, Yanagi meets Baki, who is together with Kazue in a housing estate. The purpose of Yanagi's arrival is to invite him to a duel, but Baki refuses. Yanagi had mentioned and threatened Kazue. Baki is also willing to serve Yanagi. Long story short, they arrived at a field where they were facing each other. Kazue, who was worried, asked to join the fight, but was clearly refused by Baki and immediately started the fight. Yanagi, who had been overwhelmed with attacks, had time to praise him. Baki is very strong, but now it's Yanagi's turn. With his stance, he starts moving his hands slowly, suggesting himself that his hands don't have bones, like water, which just follows the flow. This was also exemplified by Master Kunimatsu, a stance that is also capable of changing an empty hand like a sword that can split. But this time, according to Kunimatsu, Yanagi has also crossed the line and called his two hands hooked instead of human hands, got hit by several great throws in the body and hands. Baki is still able to stand up, and it turns out that Baki already knows Yanagi's move. This stance is also often called a whip attack because this has also been taught by his father. An attack like this was only a defensive technique for children and women. It wasn't used by male fighters, his father said. But even so, Baki had learned the technique. Baki started waving his arms and body, imagining he was a liquid until he attacked back. Obviously, Yanagi thought that the same move had overwhelmed him. Baki, who didn't stay still, quickly locked Yanagi's arm. In order not to feel pain, Baki asked him again to imagine that his hand was a liquid so that he would not feel pain when he was broken. But suddenly, Sikorsky, who managed to escape from prison, had come with an emotional face that wanted to finish his last fight. Baki easily dodged the slow attack. According to Yanagi, he finds it impossible to fight Baki, who is already a martial arts master. Yanagi inviting Sikorsky together to fight Baki 2-on-1 clearly. It made Kazue worried, but not Baki, who calmly faced them. Baki approached Sikorsky and quickly threw him away, who was amazed by Baki's ability to be so strong. But when you are sure that all of this is based on the power of Baki's love trying to protect his lover, it is clear that this is normal. But meanwhile, Yanagi is also confused by his poison hand attack, which doesn't have any effect on Baki, who is still able to keep attacking him. On the other hand, Sikorsky was about to attack, but had to smash Yanagi's face. Not remaining silent, Baki used the opportunity to kick him in the face. Then came Hanayama, who was amazed to see Baki, who managed to paralyze 2 prisoners at once as if he had become strong just because he had a woman to protect. It wasn't long before Yanagi and Sikorsky got back up, but Baki didn't continue the fight as he took Kazue away until the 3 of them were facing each other. But this time, Hanayama again didn't want to fight and quickly left. Obviously, the 2 of them who were ignored by their enemies seemed to feel humiliated. Moving to a port at night, it seems that Katsumi and Doyle are starting to get along and are grateful that they are still given the opportunity to improve themselves. Now Doyle intends to shepherd to a foreign land. But before that, Doyle had a request to Katsumi to teach him karate martial arts moves. Obviously, Katsumi is happy to teach it. Long story short, the time of departure has arrived, and Katsumi is the one who gives me his belt memento for the duel. Not long after, Yanagi suddenly appeared, who insinuated Doyle that embarrassed the chooser to make peace with the enemy, but Doyle, who seemed not to care, immediately started attacking. But who would have thought that Yanagi's poison hand counterattack managed to slap one of his eyes, causing Doyle to suddenly go blind? Even though, according to him, the attack earlier was a small attack, until now, Doyle could only rely on his hearing and smell. And when he smelled cigarette smoke, Doyle could already guess Yanagi's direction. Doyle, who had fallen, was still trying to hold on until Yanagi was ready in front of him with a katana which immediately slashed his hand. But fortunately, the iron in Doyle's body was able to hold it, but because of that attack, it also damaged his control, and it was time for Yanagi to attack Doyle again. Back to Sikorsky, who met Jack in the middle of town. Jack reveals that he is an enemy to you and now invites him to fight until they choose in a toilet in a building to fight. If Sikorsky has finger strength easily hanging on any object, and even the impossible one. Even so, it doesn't scare Jack to beat him until Sikorsky herds Jack out and into a payphone. So did Jack, who followed what Sikorsky wanted until the payphone position was reversed with Sikorsky, who was helpless in it. Jack casually came out with several men waiting for him to get ready to secure the box, which turned out to be Igari's men who had been abused by Sikorsky last time, who also collaborated with Jack, who in fact was an underground arena fighter. Immediately, a public telephone containing Sikorsky was put in a boxcar that was going somewhere. Meanwhile, those who had woken up were confused about where he was and remembered that he was on a public telephone. Until suddenly, the wrapping of the box opened. He was already in the middle of an underground arena that was already filled with visitors. Then came Jack to him, asking him to come out until they were facing each other. Suddenly came Tokugawa's grandfather, who explained that this was a hand-to-hand combat. But even so, Sikorsky was free to use anything to defend himself and surrendered and asked Sikorsky not to mind fighting in an official place like this. At first it felt like he was being framed, but it didn't matter to Sikorsky, and now his first opponent was Jack, who was already prepared. Sikorsky looked slightly groggy at the sight of Jack's huge muscles, and he couldn't help but fight back. Had bounced, destroying the barrier, Sikorsky felt that these seconds were what he had hoped for until Jack approached him. Sikorsky was getting ready to pull the nails out of the wooden railings. Jack's attack hit him first and sent him flying away. Sikorsky snatched a staff from the old geezer, which happened to have a sharp point that he could use to spear a weapon. But now you have to be surprised by the stomach muscles that are not easily penetrated and quickly launch attacks with nails. Yes, but that didn't matter to Jack, who apparently managed to catch it with his mouth easily, even chewing the nail whole. He was taken aback by this, but Jack said that it was time to change players, who would now be replaced with smaller fighters. This man has the nickname of an environmental expert, or is able to use everything around him to become a very deadly weapon. All the spectators had their doubts about this little man, but it was different from Tokugawa's grandfather, who was astonished. He knew that man. His name was Gaia, the fighter who also almost overwhelmed the tray, but the audience kept cheering, jeering, and putting him down until Gaia released his scent a little. All of a sudden, the arena lights vibrated, and all the spectators fell silent for a moment. Even though this is a free fight, Gaia will not use her knife or gun because she has a reputation as an environmental strategist who can take advantage of any place or situation she stands in. Now, Gaia gave an example of a sand attack. Gaia had predicted that the contents of the sand in this arena were mixed with fallen teeth that could be used as ammunition for him. When all of Sikorsky's body was completely covered in wounds from sharp, piercing teeth. Turns out that was just the beginning of Gaia's attack. Gaia, who raised the sand with both hands, pointed to the sky repeatedly so that the arena was almost filled with sand dust around her. It was clear that in such a situation, Sikorsky could not see clearly where Gaia was now. Gaia uses the sands to camouflage to blend in with the sand dust she constantly moves using her feet, making it hard to see and even confusing to attack. Sikorsky, who was getting annoyed, challenged his style to fight in a manly manner, but Gaia, who had appeared before, said he was fighting in a manly manner, but unfortunately this is not a fight here in martial arts, but a battle for survival. Now Gaia is going to give Sikorsky an unheard-of fear. Moved to Yanagi, who was in a park where he was holding a letter containing a challenge from Shibukawa. Meanwhile, Shibukawa, who was heading to the promised place, suddenly he got a vision of the shadow of a giant gate. He reminded him of the fight with Jack, who almost lost the battle in the arena below land. On the other hand, he was constantly surrounded by a thick cloud of dust that made him confused. Suddenly, an attack that was hard to predict came in succession, and sure enough, Sikorsky was really scared and panicked and even confused when Gaia was no longer carrying out attacks. Rather, it haunts him with touches on him that make Sikorsky feel mentally and physically haunted until he hears a message from Gaia that he can kill himself at any time. Back to Shibukawa, who was still trying to ignore the image of the gate, but again his brain and mind were now making an image of the vast waves in front of him. Meanwhile, Yanagi, who is in the park, meets a middle-aged man who claims to be named Motobi, a jujutsu user who is proficient in all weapons and is also known to be Jack Hanma's teacher who intends to defeat Yanagi. Meanwhile, Gaia was still continuing to frighten Sikorsky with unexpected attacks. Now Gaia gives a signal that she attacks every 10 seconds in her attacks. Now asking Sikorsky to be prepared once the count has started, Sikorsky is once again terrified of the next attacks. And when he is careless, then that is his weakness. By the end, Sikorsky was battered and terrified, admitting defeat for the first time. On the other hand, Yanagi, who had many injuries on his face due to Motobi's attack, started to take out his weapon. But that's nothing for Motobi. Here, Motobi is a little disappointed because Yanagi's original skills are very far compared to him. But somehow Yanagi still tends to use this weapon. But it wasn't long before Yanagi revived, who would now rely on his poison right hand. Unfortunately, his hand was severed due to Motobi's slash. Now Motobi asks Yanagi to immediately admit defeat. But suddenly, an unexpected figure appears who turns out to be Yujiro Hanma. It is known that the two of them are Motobi enemies who were surprised to spontaneously point him with his sword. But it was clear that holding a sword was ridiculous for the title of the strongest man on earth. But Yujiro was reluctant to serve Motobi and approached Yanagi while saying that Yanagi had lost. Yanagi was still frozen because it was the first time he had met Yujiro in person. Hanma the legend, Yanagi acknowledges Yujiro's title as the strongest human. But unfortunately in this fight, Yanagi emphasized that Yujiro has no right to determine who wins in his fight. Yujiro had time to understand what he said. This was indeed their fight, even though one of them was seriously injured with the other still standing unscathed. While no one admits defeat, the winner still cannot be determined. Until suddenly came Shibukawa, who was late arriving, which turned out to be his enemy already drenched in blood. Yujiro, who greeted Shibukawa, immediately turned around and hit Yanagi in the face. According to him, when Yanagi refused to lose, it meant that Yanagi had challenged him. Moving on a cliff in the middle of the sea. Doyle, who turns out to be still alive, rests on a cliff with a state that is still blind due to Yanagi's poisoned hand attack. Not long after that, Oliva came. Somehow he intends to catch Doyle, because that is indeed his duty. Doyle, who is still weak, must be caught. Doyle is blind and easily. Oliva suspects that it is the result of poison and immediately gives him an attack to make him faint. Now with this, the 5 convicts seeking defeat have got what they wanted. Moves in a small house where Baki and Kazue live together temporarily. But this time, the poisonous symptoms of Yanagi are starting to appear where Baki, who is already emaciated, has no appetite to eat. It clearly made Kazue sad to the point of asking him to take off his clothes, and it seemed that his body was now only covered in muscles and bones. Long story short, Baki was taken to the hospital. Shinogi, who took care of him, had a hard time, saying that he really had an illness that was somewhat impossible to cure, but amazingly, he was still able to survive until now. Kazue was crying in the middle of the park, having to be confused by Baki's condition, which was very concerning, until he was approached by a Black American man who knew Kazue's feelings, who understood that there was an important person in the hospital for him who was sick. The person gave him a doll that was considered his talisman, asking him to be patient. Everything will be fine. Moving on to a boxing building where a boxing amateur martial arts named Dave is waiting for his guests to spar about boxing until shortly thereafter arrives. What turned out to be the man meant earlier and thanked them for coming for the invitation, and they started preparing. Back at the hospital, the doctor told all his friends in the underground battle arena that Yanagi's fatal attack had managed to penetrate his flesh and even penetrate his bones. But somehow Baki was still able to survive until now. Now only a prayer can be done. Dave, who was knocked down with one attack, made a slight mistake, but this man casually and calmly read Dave's predictable moves. Moving on to a Japanese journalist who visited a luxurious house known to be the owner of the 20th century boxing legend, where he was immediately greeted by his assistant and escorted him directly to the boxing legend he meant. He is Muhammad Ali, the boxing legend, who is now suffering from Parkinson's, a disorder of the nerves that affects his movements. Here, the journalist is touched because he has been waiting for this moment to arrive after such a long time. Until finally the interview session began, but before that, Muhammad Ali asked about Yujiro Hanma, which surprised the journalist when he mentioned the name of the monster. On the other hand, at the hospital, Bak had disappeared. In fact, he chose to return to the hut because he knew that there was no cure for this disease. What is clear is that it makes Kazue sad, but to calm Kazue, he has accepted it, because this is the risk of his fight. Meanwhile, Yujiro Hanma himself has known him since childhood, this man who turns out to be the son of the legend Muhammad Ali. Back to Muhammad Ali, who explained that he recognized Yujiro Hanma because in 1976 he had come to Japan to compete in boxing with a Japanese wrestler named Igari. At that time, Ali thought that this was just an ordinary match, but the fact was that this was an infinite battle, or life and death. That's why Ali has been training more and more than usual until he is still training by running at night in the middle of the night along with several other world champion boxers to avoid media coverage. But suddenly, one by one, his friends disappeared, making him confused, which turned out to be Yujiro's doing. Realizing that he was the one who killed his friends, Ali immediately attacked. But the attack had no effect on Yujiro and was even able to avoid it. Yujiro only came to test Ali because Yujiro knows that every move Ali makes in the ring is not boxing, but martial arts moves, which is likely to be able to fend off all enemy attacks no matter how strong it is. Hearing Yujiro's words, Ali realized that he was being challenged to fight. His movement was so fast that he grazed and tore his pants. Yujiro became more and more convinced that it was a martial arts movement, not boxing, and made Yujiro enthusiastic and serious about fighting. But their fight ends peacefully, and Ali admits that he is weaker than him, but Yujiro says back that Ali is the strongest. He fought for black equality, fought against the state to protect the weak, and they have been friends ever since. Switching to a middle-aged man living in a mountain range who was also a very strong person who was able to defeat a bear alone. Now he has Baki, whom he has known since childhood, after seeing Baki's body condition taking care of the effects of a rare poison. Knowing that, he immediately made herbal concoctions to neutralize the poison, and Baki could stay here temporarily. However, on the other hand, this man named Ando realized that it was too late for Baki's disease to be treated. Back to Yujiro, who was invited to meet his son Muhammad Ali, named Ali Jr., where Ali hoped his son could follow in his footsteps to become a world boxer, and then spontaneously Ali Jr. punched. Yujiro attacked hard, making Ali Jr. bounce and cry. Then Yujiro firmly asked him to stop crying, and spontaneously his father comforted him. Moving on to Baki, who was taking a walk and entered the cave where he once promised there that he would not lose in battle. But in reality, he always loses the battle and now has to survive due to this poison. But soon they were visited by a giant cave dweller named Yasazaru. His father was killed by Baki's own father. But he has a special relationship with Baki, even though he has a grudge against his father. The story returns to the house, and Retsu is waiting for him, who is worried about Baki's condition, and Baki, who is happy to be visited, approaches him. Retsu quickly made him faint. Not long after, a helicopter came that planned to take Baki to China, more precisely to the martial arts college where Retsu was studying. It turned out that Tokugawa's grandfather was also present. Long story short, they arrived in China at the Bailin Temple to be precise and were greeted by martial arts students there. Trey is rested in the room alone and awakens confused as to where he is. On the other hand, the Kung Fu master is angry because of Retsu's proposal. He invites Baki to compete because, according to him, Baki has fulfilled the requirements as a tournament participant, even though Baki is now poisoned. Now Master asks Retsu to prove that Baki is really capable and deserves to participate in this tournament. Then we are introduced to a student named Cho, who is able to turn a boulder round with just his fist and has the potential to become the next master title. Now the weakened Baki must defeat Cho with poison. The referee started, and Cho immediately started his evasive stone attack that was able to dodge, quickly pushed his body, and even lifted him strong. However, he was reluctant to attack Baki, lowered him slowly, and continued to attack again. Long story short, Cho admits his defeat because of Baki, who cannot be underestimated and makes everyone distrust him. Now Baki is about to participate in a grand tournament. The scene shifts at dinner where Master informs Baki that a tournament is held once every 100 years. This started because in Rome there was a gladiator martial arts match, but the one who came out became the champion in the Chinese self, which started with a fighter named Like Yu, who fought Dorius. Since the arrival of Chinese fighters, Kung Fu was feared in Rome and even hated it, and since then they have removed the gladiator fight. But the tradition of the fight still continues in China, which is held once every 100 years, and those who are entitled to participate in this fight are people with master titles, including Master Retsu and all master titles across China. To find a true master, but Baki, who is not from China, is allowed to participate in this tournament. Even his father will also participate because his title of being the strongest human reaches China. So he deserves to be called a master. One of the students came to inform them that they had a guest named Ali Jr. and was immediately greeted by the master, who it turned out that the master had also known Muhammad Ali's father, and it turned out that Ali's arrival was to participate in the tournament. But before that, the master wanted to see his abilities, seeing that Ali's abilities were almost the same as his father's. The master allowed Ali Jr. to participate in this tournament. On the other hand, Baki, who, despite being seriously ill, is still training to participate in this grand tournament because Baki himself doesn't want to miss this moment to defeat his father. What is clear is that Kazue is sad, unable to bear the situation and conditions that Baki has to face. But by seeing Baki's persistence, Kazue understands that he wants to be encouraged, not pitied, and Kazue in turn encourages Baki to do his best and makes Baki stop spontaneously. Long story short, morning arrived with the tournament hall already filled with spectators and masters with Chinese titles and even foreign fighters like Yujiro Ali Jr. and Baki, who would take part in this glorious tournament.